Welcome to our channel where life's most powerful lessons unfold through tales that touch your soul. Tonight, we journey into the extraordinary story of Eleanor Reed, a woman who never expected to find her suitcases lined up on the sidewalk outside the home she'd lived in for 32 years. The home she built with her husband, the home where she raised her son. If you want to stay here, we have the garage, your dear daughter-in-law, Olivia. What drives a son to betray his own mother? And what happens when a woman who spent her entire life caring for others finally decides to stand up for herself? Eleanor's journey from heartbreak to reclaiming her dignity isn't just another story. It's a powerful testament to the strength we all possess, even when we feel most vulnerable. By the final chapter, her courageous decision will leave you breathless and perhaps looking at your own life through new eyes. If these stories of resilience and transformation resonate with you, please take a moment to subscribe. Your support allows us to continue sharing these meaningful tales. And I'm genuinely curious, what would you do in Eleanor's position? Share your thoughts in the comments below and let me know where you're listening from. Now, settle in with your favorite warm drink and let's begin this remarkable journey of betrayal, courage, and ultimately, hope. Margaret Collins, at 60 years old, never imagined she would face a life and death moment in such a dramatic way. She was out on a midday walk with her 3-year-old grandson, Noah Shaw, pushing his small stroller along the sidewalk, when a car across the street suddenly lost control. The tires screeched against asphalt, and people on the sidewalk yelled in panic. In one swift, reflexive motion faster than her own conscious thought, Margaret let go of the stroller's handle and lunged toward Noah, shoving him out of harm's way just as the vehicle careened onto the curb. The collision was forceful, knocking her to the ground so hard that her back felt as if it might split in two, and her head struck the pavement with a dull thud. In her ears, she could still hear Noah crying, that terrified little voice that let her know he was alive. At least, faintly, between the disorientation and pain, Margaret recognized shouting and frantic footsteps. Someone was calling an ambulance. An odd dizziness overcame her, and she sensed she might lose consciousness at any second. Yet, even in that haze, she picked up a familiar voice, that of Darlene Shaw, her so-called in-law, the mother of Margaret's son-in-law, Eric Shaw, who barked out, "Worthless." The single word rang sharply. Instead of gratitude that Margaret had thrown her body in front of Noah, Darlene's tone was accusatory, venomous. Margaret couldn't quite piece together the logic behind the insult, but she felt her heart twist, as though the blame of the entire incident was pinned on her. As darkness began to swallow her vision, someone bent over to check her pulse or administer first aid. The sirens of an approaching ambulance howled in the distance. Dimly, Margaret realized her right leg felt searing pain, and she struggled to inhale. The last vivid impression she had before passing out was the echo of Darlene's voice, worthless, slicing through her thoughts like a cruel brand. She had never felt more powerless or more wounded in her entire life. In the swirl of confusion, Margaret wondered if she had truly become useless, if all these years of sacrifice and care meant nothing. That question would linger like a thorn in the coming days, as events unraveled in ways Margaret would not have dared predict. By the time the paramedics lifted her onto a stretcher, Margaret had already lost consciousness, yet somewhere in her subconscious mind, she clung to the knowledge that Noah was safe, that she had protected him from harm. Perhaps that knowledge would sustain her through what was about to happen next, when the deeply buried fractures in her extended family came to light, and the unwavering sacrifice she had made for her daughter's household collided brutally with the reality of how little they valued her. Margaret's mind drifted to 3 years earlier, replaying hazy memories like a film reel skipping scenes. That was when she moved from Ohio to California to stay in her daughter's home, a decision that wasn't exactly labeled moving in. It was supposed to be temporary, just until her daughter, Lauren Shaw, recovered from severe stress and mounting financial problems. Lauren had married Eric Shaw 4 years ago and was immediately overwhelmed by the cost of a suburban Los Angeles home, her job's demands, and the surprise of becoming pregnant with Noah soon after. Back then, it seemed only logical for Margaret to step in as a helper. After all, she was Lauren's mother. She kept telling herself she would only stay for a while until Lauren found her footing. In the beginning, the arrangement seemed beneficial for everyone. Eric, a fairly conservative and proud man, was relieved to have free child care for Noah. Lauren, sweet but easily frazzled, took solace that her mother was around to handle cooking and laundry. Margaret recalled those first few weeks, how she woke up at dawn to prepare separate breakfasts to accommodate different palates, because Eric refused anything remotely spicy, while Lauren enjoyed lightly seasoned meals. Margaret washed Eric's white shirts by hand, since he claimed he hated the roughness of machine washing. Between feedings, diaper changes, and tidying up the clutter of baby toys, Margaret barely found time for her own needs. Yet, always in the back of Margaret's mind was the little voice repeating, "Just until Lauren's on her feet again." She persuaded herself that this was a noble act of motherly love, a temporary sacrifice for the sake of her child and grandchild. Every time James Collins, Margaret's husband, who stayed behind in Ohio for work, called to check in, she would paint a cheery picture. "Oh, it's fine," she'd say. "I'm a bit tired, but I'm happy to help." She never mentioned how her back ached or how she felt uneasy in a house that was not truly hers. Over time, temporary turned into months, then years, each day passing with new chores or demands. The small attic room she was given to sleep in smelled musty, the bed was stiff, and the climate in Southern California was far from the brisk air of Ohio that she missed. Moreover, Eric's mother, Darlene Shaw, hovered around often. She was a formidable woman, always meddling in Lauren and Eric's affairs. Margaret remembered the condescending remarks about how she folded shirts or seasoned dinner, as if Margaret was a lowly maid who needed strict supervision. Yet Margaret never openly complained. She had come here to help. After all, she told herself, at least Lauren appreciates it. But even Lauren's behavior started to shift. Margaret sensed her daughter withdrawing whenever Eric and Darlene made demands. Lauren seemed terrified of losing face, more intent on pleasing her husband and mother-in-law than on defending the mother who'd come to her aid. Through it all, Margaret kept forging on, telling herself it was simply part of being a supportive parent. Lauren, Margaret's only child, had always been somewhat anxious, fearful of judgment from those around her. This anxiety magnified once she got married. Concerned about mortgages, job performance, and postpartum stress, Lauren clung to the idea that having her mother in the house was the perfect solution. Margaret provided a sense of security, and for a while, that arrangement staved off Lauren's worst fears. Nonetheless, Lauren also struggled with a silent dread of exposing her family's financial vulnerabilities to others. She believed if neighbors or extended family discovered their troubles, it would reflect poorly on her. So, Lauren mostly went along with Eric's decisions, thereby allowing him to control the household, thinking that was how she could keep the peace and maintain the facade of a stable, happy home. Eric, meanwhile, was a man who didn't express gratitude easily. He saw Margaret's presence as only right, something she owed them, because, in his view, Lauren needed help, and Margaret had nowhere else to go. If Margaret faltered or messed up in the slightest, he made it known. Whether it was a missing button on his shirt or a dish that was too spicy, Eric would remark, "We can't have that here. treating Margaret as though she were incompetent. Over time, Margaret felt like an unpaid servant. More concerning was Darlene's constant meddling. She would barge in unannounced, making patronizing comments about everything from the laundry detergent to the variety of vegetables Margaret used in soup. Occasionally, Margaret wondered, how long must I keep this up? The question flitted across her mind late at night when she finally lay down in the cramped attic room, or early in the morning as she rubbed her sore back, anticipating another day of chores. She didn't complain to James, partly because she feared he would demand she return home and stop living like a maid, and partly because she was ashamed to admit how miserable she'd become. She loved Lauren and wanted to help raise Noah, so she convinced herself that her sacrifice was worth it. That is, until the day of the car accident, when everything she had believed about her value in this household was cruelly tested. On the day of that accident, it was Darlene who insisted Margaret take Noah out to buy something for dinner. Margaret would later wonder if she had refused, chosen a different route, or simply been more assertive. Perhaps the accident would not have happened. Yet that kind of self-blame led nowhere. The truth was that Margaret was deeply entangled, bound by guilt and concern for Lauren's precarious situation. She had convinced herself that her presence was indispensable. Only now, post-accident, was Margaret starting to realize that perhaps she was mostly indispensable as free labor. In the chaotic aftermath of the crash, Margaret drifted in and out of consciousness. The ambulance rushed her to the emergency room while Lauren, frantic and tearful, followed with Noah. Nurses bustled around, asking about Margaret's medical history and insurance. Meanwhile, Eric phoned the insurance provider to discover, to his dismay, that his plan did not cover Margaret because she wasn't listed as a dependent or immediate family member under his policy. The mounting concern about medical bills weighed heavily on Eric's mind, overshadowing any sympathy he might have had for his injured mother-in-law. Lauren's hands shook as she attempted to calm Noah, who was still crying in confusion. Margaret, strapped to a gurney and fighting a wave of pain, could just barely make out her daughter's anxious whispers. "I'm sorry, Mom, I'm so sorry." Through the swirling exhaustion and the ache in her back and legs, Margaret found some solace in that apology, though it was overshadowed by the hush-hush conversation she later overheard between Lauren and Darlene in the hallway. From her hospital bed, Margaret gazed at the glass panel of her room's door and glimpsed Darlene's stern expression. Skin. She couldn't hear all of the words, but phrases like, "she'd better pay her own bills," and "don't let this ruin our family's reputation" drifted through the partially open door. Lauren looked smaller than ever, almost cowering. Margaret's eyes welled with tears at the harshness of Darlene's stance, the constant fear that Lauren carried, and her own powerlessness. She thought I protected Noah. Why does everyone act like I caused this amid the swirl of medical forms, X-rays, and demands from Eric to sign documents? Margaret realized that she was about to shoulder a massive hospital bill. Sure enough, as soon as the initial surgeries and tests were confirmed, Eric appeared at her bedside, expression stony. "We don't have the means for this. You need to sign a commitment stating you'll pay." Though her leg throbbed and her head pounded, Margaret saw no choice. "So?" She scrawled her signature on the paperwork, burning with humiliation at the reality that, after years of cooking, cleaning, and caring, she was still treated as an outsider. No one, not Eric, not Darlene, not even her overwhelmed daughter, stopped to thank her for saving Noah. Instead, they demanded she assume responsibility for the financial burden of her own injuries. The swirling shame and heartbreak crested as Margaret's pen left the paper. She had never in her life felt so completely diminished. In that moment, she held two contradictory truths. She still loved Lauren and Noah deeply, enough that she would pay for the medical care if it spared her family the cost. But she also felt betrayed by a system that did not regard her as family at all. In the hours following her painful signature, Margaret's condition was thoroughly evaluated by the medical staff. The doctor explained that she had sustained a minor fracture in her leg and severe muscle tears in her lower back that would require a 3-hour surgery. Fortunately, it seemed her spine was not permanently damaged, but the recovery process would be lengthy, especially at her age. A wave of relief mingled with dread at the thought of both the physical pain and the impending bill. Lauren, hovering by the bedside, looked tormented, repeating, "I'm sorry. I should have done something." Margaret, still on strong painkillers, managed only a weak nod. She could feel her daughter's genuine worry, yet the stronger emotional weight was the feeling of being dismissed by the rest of the family. During surgery, Margaret was put under anesthesia. When she awoke, the stinging ache in her back and leg announced just how difficult the next few weeks or months of healing would be. And so began her ordeal in the hospital, an environment she found both comforting for its medical care and stifling for the sense of dependence it induced. Lauren visited daily, sometimes bringing Noah. The child's bright eyes briefly lifted Margaret's spirits, but the tension that accompanied Lauren and Eric's presence was palpable. One evening, Margaret noticed Lauren pacing the hallway outside, anxiously talking to Eric over the phone about upcoming hospital bills. Eric's voice carried through the corridor. "We can't pay for that. I'm not wasting my money on your mother." The harshness of his words stung Margaret, reaffirming her suspicion that in their eyes, she was no more than an inconvenient boarder who had become an expensive liability. It was the first time she truly let herself consider leaving. Something in her whispered, "Why stay here? They don't want you." But then came the mental protest, "No, that's your daughter and grandson. You can't abandon them." That mental tug of war ate away at her. The sweet nurse who checked her vitals remarked, "Make sure you find a calm space to recover. Stress can impede healing." Margaret wanted to laugh at the suggestion of calm. Where in that house could she possibly find peace? If she went back under Darlene's critical eye and Eric's constant demands, even now, in a hospital bed, she felt the weight of those tensions. She wondered if she was grasping for illusions. Had she convinced herself that her presence was needed when, from all appearances, she was an unwelcome obligation? After 3 hours in the operating theater, Margaret regained consciousness in a post-surgery recovery room. The anesthetic lingered, leaving her groggy. Lauren was slumped in a chair nearby, her eyes swollen from crying. The moment she noticed Margaret was awake, she rushed over, grabbing her mother's hand. "Mom, I'm so sorry," Lauren whispered, tears edging her words. "I didn't mean for it to be like this." Margaret took a labored breath, forcing a faint smile. "I know," she murmured, her voice raspy. "I just want you to be strong." Their exchange was cut short by the arrival of Darlene. She marched in with a paper bag, promptly setting it on the small rolling table. "White bread and mustard," she declared flatly. "Lauren tells me it's your favorite." Startled, Margaret locked eyes with Lauren, who looked away, flushing with what appeared to be guilt or shame. Margaret knew the truth. This was a punishment meal, something Darlene had forced Lauren to eat when she was pregnant, an unsubtle act of control masquerading as a treat. Realizing the insult veiled beneath Darlene's offering, Margaret summoned her courage, responding quietly, "Thank you, but I can't eat that. My doctor said I need proper nutrition to heal proteins and vegetables. Mustard on plain bread isn't enough." Darlene raised a brow, an incredulous stare on her face. "That's ungrateful," she snapped. "Food is food. Beggars can't be choosers, especially when we have so many expenses." Margaret's lips tightened, but she refused to yield. This is about health, not preference, she said calmly. If I eat poorly, my recovery will be compromised. Despite her composure, her heart pounded. It was the first time in years she had directly declined something Darlene offered. For a moment, the tension crackled. Then Darlene picked up her bag with a huff and left the room. Lauren hurried after her mother-in-law, presumably to smooth things over, left alone with her pounding chest. Margaret sank back into the pillows, a mixture of guilt and triumph coursing through her. She had said a firm no for the first time, refusing to be further trivialized. In the quiet that followed, she recognized the moment as a turning point. Her body was broken, but her resolve was stirring from a dormant place. If she allowed them to keep bulldozing her, how could she ever regain dignity and self-worth? This small rebellion opened her eyes. The dynamic in the Shaw household would never voluntarily change. It was up to her to decide whether to keep playing the role of subservient mother and grandmother or to break free and reclaim her life. Transferred to a general recovery room, Margaret expected her days in the hospital to be relatively peaceful. Instead, tensions escalated. Darlene popped in repeatedly with stacks of paperwork, emphasizing hospital fees and urging Margaret to find a cheaper way to handle this. Eric hovered in the doorway, often fiddling with his phone, occasionally throwing anxious glances toward his mother. It was clear that finances were the only concern on their minds. Not once did Darlene or Eric inquire about Margaret's pain levels or overall well-being. Even the flowers in the corner of the room were brought by a concerned neighbor, not by the Shaw family. While Darlene was out handling a phone call in the corridor, Lauren approached Margaret's bedside and dropped to her knees, tears brimming. "Mom, I'm trapped," she said, voice quivering. "Eric's pressuring me to push you for money. Darlene thinks you're a burden. I feel I can't breathe, but I'm stuck because I can't afford to divorce him, and we owe so much on the house. I don't want Noah to grow up with separated parents." Her confession spilled out like a torrent, revealing just how frightened and conflicted she was. Margaret's heart wrenched. She grasped Lauren's hands, seeing her daughter's desperation. It was at that moment Margaret realized that, if she stayed, she would only perpetuate the cycle, be the free caretaker they exploited. But if she left, how would Lauren cope? Would Lauren sink further into this dysfunctional setup, torn by maternal love? Margaret gently nodded and said, "I understand, dear. I'll think of a solution, but I can't go on like this forever. I need to heal, too." Tears slipped down Lauren's cheeks. She nodded, pressing Margaret's hands to her forehead. The guilt in her eyes told Margaret everything Lauren did love her mother, but fear and financial desperation overshadowed it. Outside in the hallway, Darlene's brisk footsteps signaled a return to confrontation. Margaret steeled herself. She noticed the scribble of a financial statement in Darlene's hand through the gap in the door. A calm voice in Margaret's mind reminded her that she couldn't play savior indefinitely. She squeezed Lauren's hand once more before Darlene re-entered, face set in a tight scowl. "Have you sorted out your bills yet?" Darlene demanded. Margaret locked eyes with her. "I'm working on it," she answered evenly. Beneath that restrained reply, she was certain of one thing: her illusions about being valued in this household were well and truly shattered. 2 days later, Margaret lay in bed, drifting in and out of an uneasy doze, when Darlene marched in with another offering, a loaf of cheap white bread and packaged mustard. She dropped them on the bedside table. "Here, in case you need something to eat." This time, Margaret did not even pretend. "No, thank you," she said firmly. The air crackled with tension. Darlene's eyes narrowed, obviously unaccustomed to resistance from the older woman she had long treated like a servant. Lauren was in the corner, watching fearfully. biting her lip. Eric stood behind Darlene, arms folded, annoyance etched on his face. In that moment, Margaret decided she'd had enough. Over the next few hours, as she wavered between rest and medication-induced haziness, Margaret resolved to stop ignoring her own dignity. That night, she refused to eat the nutritionally empty food Darlene brought, and when Lauren timidly asked her to reconsider, Margaret simply shook her head. "I need real nourishment to heal," she repeated. Lauren, swallowing her protests, later snuck a fruit cup and some grilled chicken from the hospital cafeteria for her. Despite the continuing tension, it was the first sign of a small stand Lauren tried to take on behalf of her mother. In the quiet of the following morning, with Darlene and Eric off managing financial concerns, Lauren sat by Margaret's bed, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Mom," she whispered, "I don't know what to do." Margaret felt a flicker of sympathy and exhaustion. Could she truly help Lauren if her daughter refused to stand up to her husband and mother-in-law? She wasn't sure. Yet love for her daughter still filled her heart, and she heard herself making a promise she wasn't fully certain she could keep. "We'll figure something out, but I can't keep living for everyone else." That same afternoon, Eric arrived with a document in hand, more forms, apparently, requiring Margaret's signature to finalize her commitment to pay the ballooning hospital bills. Margaret swallowed her frustration, sensing a subtle threat in Eric's gaze. She recognized the pattern for years. She had yielded to every demand, from cooking multiple meals daily to living in substandard conditions. Now, especially with Darlene fueling Eric's sense of entitlement, the demands were escalating. Margaret felt the last threads of her illusion snap. "I need time," she said, faking a polite smile and returning the unsigned forms to Eric's hands. His glare revealed how unacceptable he found that answer. But this time, Margaret wouldn't yield just because of a bullying stare. When he left in a huff, slamming the door behind him, she was left with Lauren, who sank into a chair, burying her face in her hands. Margaret wanted to hold her daughter, to tell her everything would be fine, but she also sensed a fundamental truth. This dynamic would never truly end unless she herself left. That evening, she lay awake, listening to the beeping of machines, the distant footsteps of night shift nurses, and finally felt a surge of determination. She loved Lauren, loved Noah, but it was time to recognize her worth. Enough illusions, enough indefinite sacrifice. Late that night, after all the tension, Lauren came to Margaret's hospital room alone. The only light was the muted glow of the corridor lamp. She dropped onto her knees beside the bed, tears streaming once again, her voice ragged with desperation. "Mom, I can't divorce Eric," she confessed in a low whisper. "I'm terrified. The house is under both our names. The mortgage is huge, and I feel so trapped. If I lose him, I lose everything. But I also can't keep going like this. Please, can you just let me hold your retirement account card for a bit? We can use it to pay the hospital bills, mortgage, everything. I promise we'll give it back to you eventually." Margaret's chest tightened. She had that 401k debit card tucked away for emergencies, her own future. Yet here was Lauren, scared and cornered, begging for lifelines. For a fleeting moment, Margaret's mind flashed to the day she first arrived to help Lauren, believing it was merely a brief sacrifice. Had all that effort led only to this, a cycle of emotional blackmail and desperation? Still, maternal love wavered in her heart. She reached out, brushing tears from Lauren's cheek. "All right," she said, her voice trembling. "But on one condition, if this spirals out of control, you have to tell me the truth immediately." Lauren nodded rapidly, clinging to Margaret's hand as though it were a lifeline. Margaret pressed the worn debit card into Lauren's shaking palm. The younger woman's face flashed a mix of relief and sorrow. She hugged Margaret, sobbing quietly. "Thank you. I swear. I won't let you down." Margaret wanted to believe her, yet experience had taught her caution. Early the next morning, before Eric and Darlene arrived, Margaret asked a sympathetic head nurse to witness a lost card report to the retirement plan administrator. On the official forms, Margaret claimed she had misplaced her 401k card. It would take 14 days for a new one to be issued and the old one to be invalidated. A subtle move of self-protection, no doubt. She did not want to brand Lauren a thief, but she had also seen Eric's cunning manipulations. If he tried to siphon the account dry, he'd find the card would no longer work. Sitting back in her hospital bed, Margaret felt torn guilty for not trusting her daughter, relieved she wasn't entirely helpless, and uneasy about the future. This half-surrender, half-defensive tactic felt like the best she could manage. Hours later, Eric showed up, brandishing a power of attorney form, insisting that Margaret sign over the right for him to withdraw funds from the 401k. Margaret played dumb, shaking her head weakly. "I can't sign anything right now," she said. "I've misplaced the card, so the account's inactive." Eric's expression hardened with frustration. She locked eyes with him calmly, refusing to bend. This was her ultimatum. She would not keep blindly offering herself as a solution for their household's never-ending crises. A few hours after Eric's attempt to secure full access to her funds, Margaret sensed the strained atmosphere around her intensify. Eric's refusal to speak more than a curt sentence, Lauren's anxious glances, and Darlene's snarling presence told Margaret all she needed to know. They wanted that money now, and her mistake was a direct challenge to their plans. Yet, for once, Margaret did not succumb to guilt. She had spent 3 years and more giving everything she had, only to discover that unconditional sacrifice earned her nothing but more demands. That evening, Lauren came in and confessed Eric is furious. "He said you're turning your back on this family." Margaret nodded, struggling with the conflict of wanting to comfort her child, yet standing firm. "I'm not turning my back on anyone," she said quietly. "I just need to protect myself, too." Lauren looked away, tears in her eyes. Margaret felt a pang, but her choice was made. The time for passivity was over. As the evening wore on, Margaret let her mind wander back to Ohio. She remembered the small kitchen garden she used to tend with James, how they would chat over morning coffee. She recalled James's phone calls in which he gently asked, "Are you sure you're all right?" and how she always answered, "Yes, don't worry." For the first time, she allowed herself to admit she wanted to go home truly, and not just physically. She wanted to escape this endless cycle of belittlement and disrespect. At dawn, she summoned the courage to call James. Her phone was lost in the accident, but a nurse let her use a landline. After telling James everything her injuries, the money fiasco, Darlene's bullying, she broke down in tears. On the other end, James was silent for a moment, then spoke in a steady voice. "I'm sorry you've gone through this alone. I'll leave tonight, drive all the way. It's a 10-hour trip, but I'll get there to bring you home." Margaret hung up, tears streaking her cheeks, a mix of relief and shame that she had not told him sooner. By noon, Margaret had made arrangements for discharge. Though the doctor advised ongoing care, he agreed she could continue physical therapy from home if someone were there to assist her. That someone would be James, who would arrive in the next day or so. Margaret told Lauren, quietly but firmly, "I'm leaving. Please pack my things before James arrives. I'd like to avoid any unnecessary drama." Lauren's reaction was a pale face and trembling lip. "Mom, please, think about Noah," she whispered. but Margaret only lowered her gaze. I have, she said. This is the only choice left. The following day, James Collins arrived at the hospital, covered in road dust from the long drive from Ohio to California. Margaret's heart lifted at the sight of his kindly face, lined with worry and exhaustion. No longer did she feel alone. As he hugged her gently, she sensed his quiet anger at the situation, though he kept his composure in front of Lauren and Eric, who stood off to the side. Darlene didn't bother to show her face. Probably for the best. Margaret mused. The last thing she wanted was a confrontation. Margaret signed her discharge papers. A nurse wheeled her out to the parking lot. The tension in the air was thick. Eric hovered behind, occasionally mumbling about how this hospital stay is costing a fortune, while Lauren tried to say farewell through tears, hugging Noah in her arms. Darlene's condemnation echoed from prior conversations, accusations of Margaret being selfish for daring to leave. As James helped Margaret into the car, she glanced at Lauren one last time. I love you, honey, she said softly. Take care of Noah. I'm always a phone call away. Lauren nodded, sobbing. She reached out as if she wanted to hold on to Margaret, but fear and confusion held her back. The drive stretched for hours, James making frequent stops so Margaret could rest. Guilt and relief fought within her. She had dreamed of going home many times, but never did she envision it under these circumstances, fleeing her daughter's household in a swirl of debt, resentment, and heartbreak. At a rest stop, James bought her a bottle of water and her favorite granola bar. Baby steps, he said, voice laden with concern. Are you sure about this? Margaret raised her chin, forcing a small smile. I am. I have to start choosing myself. Otherwise, I'll be stuck in that loop forever. They continued the journey in stretches of quiet, occasionally punctuated by phone calls from neighbors or friends who heard about the accident. Margaret felt anxiety spike whenever the phone rang, worried it might be Lauren begging her to return. But the calls were mostly from well-wishers. One old friend in Ohio offered to cook them a meal once they arrived. Another insisted she come to church on Sunday to pray for a swift recovery. Margaret's chest tightened with gratitude for the unwavering kindness from her old community, something she'd lacked in California. As the miles rolled by, Margaret reflected on all the illusions she had harbored. She recalled vividly how she had told herself that a mother's duty never ends, how she believed her presence was truly indispensable. She realized now that love and support must go both ways. In the Shaw household, her generosity was drained dry and rewarded with scorn. Perhaps, at one point, it had been genuine need, but it warped into exploitation over time. Looking out the window at the open road ahead, Margaret silently vowed that the rest of her days would not be spent as someone else's doormat. The last night Margaret spent in California had been restless, her mind racing with second thoughts. But seeing James in person and feeling the steadiness of his presence reassured her. As they crossed the state border, something inside Margaret began to loosen an invisible cord of tension that had held her tight to the Shaw household. In the passenger seat, she adjusted the support brace around her back, wincing from a dull ache, yet also hopeful for the first time in a long while. When they finally reached their Ohio home, the sky was turning light. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, murmuring about the commotion. The house itself felt eerily familiar, yet changed dust gathered on the furniture, and the lawn was overgrown, evidence of the 3 years Margaret had been away. James helped her inside, leading her gently to a bed he had prepared. Rest now, he said. Margaret nodded, tears brimming. She felt a wave of comfort from the worn blankets, the faint smell of her own home. She never realized how precious that sense of belonging could be until it was lost. Yet the respite was short-lived. Only hours after arriving, James received a call from a concerned neighbor who said, "I saw on social media your daughter and her husband claiming you guys abandoned them. They're posting videos on TikTok." Confused, Margaret asked James to check. Sure enough, on his phone, he found that Lauren and Eric had started a TikTok channel with a dramatic title, "Abandoned by Our Own Parents." They showed footage of a tearful Lauren holding Noah, claiming Margaret and James had deserted them with medical bills and a mortgage. The story was full of twisted facts, leaving out how Margaret had been forced to sign her own hospital invoices, or how Eric and Darlene had demanded the retirement fund. Instead, they painted a picture of heartless grandparents. Margaret sat there, dumbfounded, scanning the clip. She heard Lauren's sob-laden voice. "My mother walked away right after we needed her to help with the hospital costs. We have no one left." It stung deeply, knowing her daughter was complicit in distorting the truth this way. James placed a hand on her shoulder. "Don't let them drag you down. We know what really happened." Margaret pressed her hands together, fighting off a sense of betrayal. If Lauren was truly so desperate that she stooped to public smears, what else might she do that night? Margaret and James barely slept. The hospital bed hardly had time to rest her exhausted frame. Instead, they lay awake in the living room, the glow of a single lamp illuminating the concern etched on their faces. Margaret felt torn between wanting to defend herself and not wishing to fan the flames of a public scandal. But the next morning, the swelling wave of hateful comments on TikTok directed at them made it clear that silence would only embolden falsehoods. Over the next day, Margaret and James discovered that the TikTok drama was exploding. Strangers online were leaving scathing comments, calling Margaret a fake grandmother, a monster, and worse. Some threatened to expose the Collinses for elder neglect if only they knew the real story. Margaret's hands shook as she scrolled through the vitriol. She had never been involved in social media warfare. She barely understood how platforms like TikTok worked. Yet here she was, unexpectedly at the center of a digital storm. After calming down, James pulled up a chair and said firmly, "We can't just let them spread these lies." Margaret sighed, wincing at the twinge in her healing back. "But how do we respond?" she asked. "We're not media savvy." James rubbed his chin. "I'll record you. You can speak plainly, from the heart, and show the receipts everything you've paid for over the years, the official hospital documents, the evidence from the accident. It's our word against theirs. But we have proof." They set up a smartphone on the kitchen table. In a shaky but resolute voice, Margaret introduced herself on camera. "Hello, my name is Margaret Collins. I'm the mother of Lauren Shaw and grandmother to Noah Shaw. For years, I lived in their home, provided childcare, did chores, and financed many of my grandson's needs. I paid for my own hospital costs after I was injured, saving Noah in a car accident. The insurance my daughter's family has did not cover me, and they demanded I turn over my entire retirement account. When I refused, they made it seem like I abandoned them. Here are the receipts." Margaret then held up paperwork from medical forms, showing she was the guarantor for her own treatment, to grocery bills for Noah, to the out-of-pocket costs she had covered for baby formula and clothes. It was painful, having to publicly defend herself against her daughter and son-in-law, but the wave of online aggression necessitated it. James posted the video on his small Facebook page and YouTube channel, hoping it might circulate enough to let people see their side. Then they waited. By evening, an acquaintance from church texted them, "Your video's picking up steam. People are sharing it like crazy." Indeed, by the following morning, hundreds, then thousands of people watched Margaret's calm, factual account. Sympathetic comments began flooding in, offering well wishes for her recovery and condemnation of Lauren and Eric's manipulative tactics. A neighbor from Ohio chimed in with a testimonial Margaret used to babysit my kids. She's the sweetest. This is so unfair. A couple of philanthropic lawyers reached out privately to offer pro bono advice. Slowly but surely, the public narrative shifted. Within a mere day, Margaret's quiet life in Ohio transformed into a swirl of notifications, messages, and comments, some supportive, some skeptical. Where strangers had once launched attacks, they now apologized or expressed outrage at the deception. Several savvy internet users delved into Eric's background, uncovering old credit issues and questionable financial moves, fueling further doubt about his integrity. Meanwhile, others discovered that Lauren had posted earlier TikTok videos painting her family as the perfect American household, which sharply contrasted the sob story she was now telling. The more the internet community investigated, the more cracks appeared in Lauren and Eric's narrative. Panicked by the backlash, Eric tried to do damage control, but it was too late. So, people reported Lauren's TikTok channel for misleading content, especially once the real documents from Margaret circulated. TikTok flagged the channel, and before long, it was suspended. Their pleas for sympathy dried up instantly. Online donors retracted, and the false narrative disintegrated. Lauren began calling Margaret's phone repeatedly, leaving tearful voicemails. "Mom, I didn't want it to get this out of hand. Eric said it would help us stay afloat. I'm so sorry. Her messages cut off in sobs. Margaret, heart heavy, listened to each message. She felt torn again beneath the anger and betrayal. She still loved her daughter. But how many times could she rescue Lauren from the consequences of her own actions? James, more pragmatic, reminded Margaret, "You did what you had to do. If we'd stayed silent, the lies would have continued." Margaret nodded, her gaze lingering on the phone. "I know," she whispered. Deep down, the heartbreak of knowing her own child had orchestrated such a smear campaign, coerced or not stung more than any condemnation from strangers. Sometimes, she wished they could have resolved it privately, but the die was cast, and with the truth out in the open, there was no turning back. In the days that followed, the hailstorm of online commentary began to subside, replaced by the next internet scandal. Still, the residual effect on Lauren and Eric was profound. Furious netizens unearthed Eric's attempts at financial scams, bombarding his workplace with emails about his unethical online behavior. Eric was suspended from his job, pending an internal investigation. Lauren's social media persona lay in tatters, ridiculed by the same followers she once courted for help. Margaret wished none of this had been necessary, but she reminded herself they were the ones who initiated the public smear. This was the cost of such duplicity. The unraveling of their TikTok ruse spelled disaster for Eric and Lauren's finances. Eric's job suspended him without pay, and given the strict company policies, his dismissal seemed imminent. Banks began calling in overdue loans. Even Darlene, who had largely orchestrated the manipulative drama, realized the scandal had backfired. She went silent for a time. Lauren's social circle shrank overnight, many friends scorning her for the online fiasco. In desperation, Lauren phoned Margaret, stammering apologies, claiming Eric had forced her hand. "He insisted we do it," she sobbed. "We really had no other way out of our debt." Margaret listened quietly, torn between sympathy and anger. "Lauren," she said softly, "I only ever wanted to help you, but you went too far. You let Eric exploit you, and in doing so, you hurt me deeply. I can't fix this for you. You must figure out how to stand on your own." Her daughter's muffled cries tugged at Margaret's heart, but she remained firm. It was clear that Lauren craved comfort. yet refused to break away from Eric or confront Darlene's controlling grip. Legal complications loomed. Some online users hinted at pressing charges for defamation, though Margaret felt reluctant to escalate the matter that far. She merely wanted her name cleared, which it now was to a large extent. She told James, "I can't keep fueling hatred. All I want is peace." Oh. He agreed, advising her to let the uproar die down. A few local news outlets approached them for interviews, intrigued by the internet drama pitting a mother against her daughter. Margaret and James politely declined. They needed time to recover, both physically and emotionally. Margaret was still in physical therapy for her back, grateful for a local center that specialized in older adult injuries. Every small improvement in her mobility felt like a triumph. With each step forward, she resolved to move toward a new phase of life free of exploitation and guilt. Yet in quiet moments, Margaret grieved. She mourned the daughter she remembered, the sweet, affectionate girl who'd once been her pride and joy. It pained her to see how fear and the influence of others had driven Lauren to such extremes. But for now, Margaret realized she had to focus on her own path. She couldn't fix Lauren's life if Lauren persisted in destructive patterns. Destin. Reluctant acceptance settled in her heart. Sometimes a parent's love must be tough enough to say no. Just as Margaret dared to hope that the worst was behind them, a new upheaval shattered her tenuous peace. She was at a physical therapy session, gingerly practicing walking exercises. When her phone buzzed, a neighbor from the Ohio block told her, panicked, "There's a break-in at your house. I saw people forcing a window open." Margaret froze, anxiety stabbing her chest. She signaled James, who was waiting in the lobby. At once, he called the police. The concept of a burglary was terrifying enough, but a dreadful suspicion gnawed at Margaret, who would target their modest home within an hour. James arrived at the scene, meeting police officers in front of the Collins residence. The front door was intact, but a side window had been shattered. A few onlookers stood on the sidewalk, whispering about the ruckus. To James's shock, the intruders were not strangers. It was Lauren, Eric, and Darlene caught in the act by the responding officers, rummaging through cabinets, presumably searching for something. When confronted, Lauren burst into tears, stammering excuses. "It's not burglary. This is my mother's house. I just need her retirement card or documents. Something to help us survive." Eric was more defiant, barking that Margaret owed them money. Darlene, never short on arrogance, insisted, "This is family property. We have every right to be here." The police weren't persuaded. The deed was in James and Margaret's names. Nothing gave Lauren, Eric, and Darlene legal access to break in and rifle through private belongings. Seeing Lauren in handcuffs, her tear-streaked face, crumpled in shame, nearly wrecked Margaret when she arrived minutes later. The officers asked Margaret and James to verify that they were the homeowners and sign a statement about the damage and attempted theft. Eric ranted, "Look what you're doing to us. If you'd just given us the money, we wouldn't have to do this." Margaret shook her head, stunned by how delusional this logic was. She had not forced them to pick up a crowbar and break windows. Crestfallen, Margaret observed Darlene, Eric, and Lauren as they were escorted into the police cruiser. She felt an avalanche of guilt and heartbreak. This was not the resolution she'd wanted. Darlene hissed insults at her, claiming Margaret was to blame for their ruin. Yet, the truth was undeniable. They had attempted a break-in and faced legal consequences. Margaret turned away as they drove off, tears stinging her eyes. The swirling despair in her chest testified to how drastically her relationship with her daughter had collapsed and how unstoppable the downward spiral had become once they chose criminal methods to seize her assets. Later that evening, Margaret and James sat at the local police station, giving official statements about the incident. The officers explained that Lauren, Eric, and Darlene would be held for up to 24 hours. After that, if bail was posted, they could await trial outside of detention. The recommended charges ranged from trespassing to attempted burglary. Though some might be reduced or dropped if the parties reached a settlement, every word of the police report pierced Margaret's heart. She never thought her own flesh and blood would stoop to forcibly entering her home. As she signed papers detailing the property damage, broken window frame, rummaged drawers, scattered personal effects, she couldn't shake the vision of Lauren's tearful face. Despite the betrayal, a part of Margaret still wanted to console her daughter. Yet she recognized she could not simply brush aside a crime. The legal system had to run its course. James walked her out of the station. Under the fluorescent lights of the parking lot, he wrapped an arm around Margaret's shoulders. "I'm so sorry," he murmured, voice thick with empathy. Margaret's eyes glistened, but she blinked the tears back. "We tried everything," she whispered, voice shaky. "I tried to help them for years, and this is what it's come to." Inside, a cacophony of sorrow and disbelief raged. How had it escalated from caring for her family to pressing charges against them in the following days? Details emerged. Eric posted bail first, leveraging a final line of credit. Ice, mice. Darlene and Lauren followed soon after, though Lauren seemed too mortified to contact Margaret. Only Darlene, unrepentant, spewed vitriol on social media, blaming Margaret for forcing them to act out of desperation. In an even more devastating turn, Eric's suspension from work officially became a termination when the HR department reviewed his criminal charges. The same office had also received complaints from individuals about his online harassment and false fundraising. The pink slip landed swiftly. With no employment, an expensive mortgage, and looming legal fees, the Shaw family was in dire straits. As painful as it all was, Margaret found a measure of clarity. Every factor in her extended family's unraveling pointed back to a pattern of entitlement and manipulation. She had once believed that unwavering sacrifice could hold the family together. Now she saw it only enabled more exploitation. The break-in was a final, irrevocable crossing of boundaries. Gazing out her kitchen window at dusk, Margaret clasped her hands, fighting off the lingering ache in her back. Part of her still wanted to rescue Lauren from the mess, but the law now overshadowed maternal instincts. She prayed her daughter would finally realize the error of their ways, but they would have to walk that path alone. Before long, a letter arrived summoning Margaret and James to a preliminary civil hearing. Their lawyer explained it was standard procedure. The court would evaluate the extent of damages from the break-in and consider restitution. Potential criminal charges for Lauren, Eric, and Darlene also loomed, depending on how the case proceeded. Faced with this grim necessity, Margaret had no intention to withdraw the complaint, as the police themselves had witnessed the trespass and property damage. She realized that, at this juncture, leniency was not hers alone to give. The law was involved. In a surprising move, Lauren wrote a letter to her mother, handwritten, with trembling lines. It read, "Mom, I'm so sorry. I never wanted things to go this far. Eric said we'd just get the documents to fix our financial crisis. I was desperate. Please don't let them send us to jail. Think of Noah." Margaret gripped the letter, tears welling. She recalled Noah's bright little face in happier times, though her contact with him had been severed since she left California. Did Lauren even realize how manipulative it was to mention Noah like that? Or was she truly grasping at straws? Nevertheless, the wheels of justice churned on, independent of Margaret's personal feelings. Darlene, still defiant, threatened to countersue, though her claims had no basis in legal fact. Margaret's lawyer assured her that any countersuit would likely be dismissed. The bigger concern was how the fiasco would impact Margaret's health. Stress was the last thing she needed. She was still wearing a brace for her back, enduring physical therapy sessions 3 times a week. On one such therapy afternoon, Margaret paused in the middle of her exercises, overwhelmed by the swirl of it all. Her therapist approached, gently inquiring if she needed a break. With a heavy sigh, Margaret nodded. She stared at her own reflection in a wall mirror, an older woman who had given so much to protect her daughter and grandson, yet ended up in this painful, surreal predicament. Glancing down at her stiff leg, she acknowledged she was still healing from her injuries, and now she had to heal from a broken heart, too. By the time she finished therapy and made it home, James was waiting with a comforting mug of tea. "You all right?" he asked, worry etched into his features. Margaret sat down carefully and exhaled. "I'll manage. It's all I can do now." The faint aroma of chamomile enveloped her senses, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. Though it was an uphill battle, she reminded herself that no matter what happened with the Shaw family, her own life was still in her hands. 3 months later, a civil court session convened to address the trespassing and property damage. Margaret and James arrived, accompanied by their lawyer, while Lauren, Eric, and Darlene appeared under the counsel of a visibly exasperated attorney. Prior to the hearing, negotiations had taken place. Ultimately, Eric agreed to a settlement he would pay $20,000 in restitution, covering repairs to Margaret's window, compensation for emotional distress, and a lump sum for grandchild support, an amount reflecting some of Margaret's unpaid caregiving expenses over the years. Darlene, though outraged, had no choice but to accept, as the evidence was irrefutable. The settlement did not erase the emotional wounds Margaret had endured. Watching Lauren sign the agreement, eyes hollow, pained Margaret profoundly. She recognized that this might be the closest thing to an acknowledgement from Lauren that the break-in was wrong. Beyond the money, it was a moral admission. The official proceeding ended swiftly, the judge noting they had all signed voluntarily. Criminal charges still lingered for trespass, but the partial settlement in civil court might mitigate sentencing. Margaret left the courthouse feeling no triumph, only a dull ache of finality. That evening, James fixed a simple dinner. As they ate quietly in their living room, Margaret contemplated the next step. The old Ohio house held too many painful memories. She couldn't glance at the side window without recalling Lauren and Eric's break-in. After a somber discussion, the couple decided to sell the property and move somewhere entirely new. James's job was flexible enough to allow for relocation, and Margaret yearned for a fresh environment to continue her therapy. The money from the settlement, combined with the proceeds of the house sale, would be enough to finance a simpler life elsewhere. They decided on Santa Barbara, a serene coastal area in California, not too close to Lauren, but warmer than Ohio and conducive to healing walks by the ocean. They found a small cottage to rent, complete with a modest backyard for Margaret's beloved herb garden. Within weeks, the sale of their Ohio home closed, and they bid farewell to the house that had witnessed both joys and heartbreak. James loaded their possessions into a moving truck, while Margaret oversaw final paperwork. There was a faint, bittersweet sense of relief as the truck pulled away. This was a departure from old pain, a step toward new beginnings. Once settled in Santa Barbara, Margaret began a fresh regimen of physical therapy, gently testing her limits with daily walks along the shore. She inhaled the salty sea breeze, feeling it clear her mind. James took up a part-time position at a local library, leaving him ample time to care for Margaret and enjoy the coastal scenery. Their new home, a tiny cottage with chipped white paint, felt cozy and personal. Margaret planted rosemary and lavender out back, delighting in the return of her green thumb. In time, the persistent ache in her back receded, replaced by a determined will to rebuild her life. Day by day, she gained stamina, tackling a short stroll on the beach one morning, practicing back stretches another. Occasionally, the trauma of the past flashed across her thoughts: the car accident, the hospital drama, the ruthless demands from Eric and Darlene, and the heartbreak of Lauren's participation in it all. Yet, in the gentle hush of the Pacific waves, she found a kind of absolution. She told herself, I tried my best. Now I must care for myself. One afternoon, her phone buzzed Lauren. Margaret's heart fluttered. She hesitated but answered. Lauren's voice spilled out, trembling with anger and desperation. Mom, we're out of money again, she said. Eric can't find a new job. The bank might foreclose the house. You can't let us drown like this. The words stung, echoing the old pattern of demands. Margaret's throat went tight. She calmly replied, I'm sorry you're struggling, but I have nothing left to give. Lauren's voice rose, turning spiteful. Then don't expect me to care if you're dying alone in a hospital bed? She hung up, leaving Margaret stunned and pained. James, returning from the porch, saw Margaret's shaken expression. What happened? He asked quietly. Slowly, she relayed Lauren's threat. Emotion churned, but a curious calm emerged. Margaret inhaled, the tang of salt in the air steadying her. I'm all right, she whispered. I finally choose myself. The memory of that phone call haunted her for a while. She missed Noah, worried about him. But Margaret understood she could not rescue a child from parents who refused to change. She had to trust that one day, the boy might find his way back to her when he was older. For now, she had to protect her newfound equilibrium. That evening, they strolled hand in hand along the golden sands of the beach. The sky stained pink and orange at sunset. Each step Margaret took felt purposeful, a testament to her journey from silent martyrdom to measured independence. She no longer yearned for validation from people who offered no genuine care. Instead, she embraced the gentler rhythms of her own life, hoping that with time, the heartbreak would diminish. A full year passed after Margaret's departure from the Shaw household. In her quaint cottage on a tranquil street in Santa Barbara, she carefully arranged small ornaments and a festive wreath to mark the Christmas season. Through the window, the late afternoon sunlight spilled onto a set of holiday cards she was preparing to mail to friends at the Senior Wellness Center, the place she attended for group exercise and gentle yoga. One card displayed a simple motto, handwritten in Margaret's neat script: Love yourself first. Only then can family ties be truly strong. It was a line that reflected everything she had learned. She had always equated love with ceaseless sacrifice, but discovered the painful truth that loving without boundaries can backfire, harming both the giver and the recipient. Yes, she missed Noah a stabbing regret whenever she saw small children frolicking on the shore. But she had come to terms with the reality that forcing proximity wouldn't help if the environment was toxic. She still harbored hope that one day, her grandson would understand the steps she took to ensure her own well-being. James wandered in, glimpsing the cards. He smiled warmly, placing a comforting hand on Margaret's shoulder. That's a lovely line, he remarked. I'm sure it'll resonate with your friends. Margaret nodded, affixing a stamp. For a moment, she let her mind drift to the multiple phone calls, letters, and legal battles from a year prior. That chaos felt distant now, overshadowed by the quiet mornings and restful nights in their beachside haven. Standing by the window, Margaret caught sight of a brilliant sunset, its vivid hues reflecting on the calm sea. She let herself breathe it in, feeling the old wounds in her back settle into a distant ache. She was content to live without the heavy yoke of thankless duty, content to let time mend fractured relationships at its own pace or not at all. "We're all done decorating," James announced, turning on a string of Christmas lights that glowed softly around the window frame. Margaret nodded, returning his smile. "Let's take a walk on the shore before it gets too dark," she suggested. And so they stepped outside into the crisp air, Margaret leaning on James's arm. The gentle crash of waves drew them forward, each footstep in the sand a testament to lessons learned and burdens shed. Though the future remained uncertain, especially regarding Lauren and Noah, Margaret felt a calm resolve. She had chosen herself, had reclaimed her worth, and the final peace that enveloped her heart signaled an abiding truth. Love that is real and enduring must begin with self-respect. Thank you for staying with us through Margaret's emotional journey on her Fireside Stories. Her decision to finally choose herself after years of quiet sacrifice reminds us all of the importance of setting healthy boundaries, even with those we hold closest. I hope Margaret's strength resonated with you and perhaps encouraged you to prioritize your own well-being. If you enjoyed this story, please hit the subscribe button. It helps the channel grow and allows me to continue bringing you heartfelt narratives each week. I genuinely love your feedback. Did Margaret make the right choice? Have you ever experienced something similar? Share your opinions below, and don't forget to mention where you're tuning in from. Until next time, stay warm and keep your heart open.